The cantina smelled of burnt circuits and stale alcohol, a testament to the kind of business that thrived on the space station. Jonas Cade sat alone in a shadowy booth, his back to the wall, and his eyes scanning the room like a predator in an unfamiliar jungle. The dim lighting accentuated the deep lines of his face, carved by years of hard living. A data chip rested on the table in front of him, its dull metallic sheen catching the flickering neon lights overhead. He hated jobs like this, the kind that started in dark corners and ended with someone being bought or sold. But he wasn't in a position to turn it down. His ship, the Endless Horizon, was barely holding together, and the fuel reserves were critically low. The credits promised for this job could keep him flying, and in Jonas's world, survival trumped morality. The man sitting across from him leaned forward, his voice a silken purr that Jonas instinctively distrusted. "You're perfect for this," he said, his pale fingers drumming a rhythmic beat on the table. "No strings, no complications, just pick them up and deliver them. Easy money." Jonas stared at him. He didn't trust anyone who said easy money. "Who are they?" Jonas asked, his tone clipped. "Giari," the man replied, lowering his voice as if the word itself were illicit. "A widow and her child, high-value cargo. You take them to Call to 5, drop them off with the Baron's men, and collect your fee. Simple." Jonas's lips tightened. He'd heard of the Giari before, a rare and reclusive alien species, their glowing violet skin and empathic abilities making them both beautiful and dangerous in the eyes of those who sought to exploit them. For centuries, the Giari had lived in isolation, avoiding the prying eyes of galactic powers. But that seclusion had turned them into targets. Now poachers, slavers, and warlords hunted them, seeking to use their abilities for personal gain. "What's the Baron want with them?" Jonas asked, though he suspected he already knew. The man's smile was cold and practiced. "The Baron's interests are not your concern. You're a transporter, not a philosopher." Jonas hated himself for not walking away. The word cargo hung in the air like a bad smell. These weren't crates or minerals. They were people. But people with a price tag. He exhaled sharply, sliding the chip into his pocket. "Half up front," he said, standing. "You'll get it when you meet the merchandise," the man replied, rising as well. "Docking Bay 9. Midnight. Don't be late." Jonas arrived at Docking Bay 9 10 minutes early, his hand resting on the grip of his blaster. The air was colder here, the faint hiss of pressurized oxygen filling the silence. He scanned the area, every shadow a potential threat. The cargo stood near the loading ramp of a small freighter, a woman and a child. The woman was tall and regal, despite the tattered shawl draped over her shoulders. Her violet skin shimmered faintly under the harsh lights, the intricate patterns etched into her flesh glowing softly like starlight. Her eyes, a piercing amethyst, locked onto Jonas as he approached, filled with a quiet but unyielding defiance. The child clung to her leg, half hiding behind the folds of the shawl. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her small face peeked out, her luminous eyes wide with curiosity and fear. She held a frayed cloth doll, its stuffing poking out from a torn seam. "You're the cargo?" Jonas asked, his voice gruff. The woman straightened, her chin lifting slightly. "I am Lyra. This is my daughter Kira." Jonas stiffened. Names made things personal. He didn't want personal. "Do you have your things?" he asked, ignoring her attempt to humanize the situation. "We have nothing left to bring," Lyra replied, her tone sharp. "Only ourselves." He nodded toward the ship. "Get aboard." Lyra hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward the docking bay entrance, as if calculating the odds of escape. Jonas caught the look and shook his head. "Don't try it. You won't get far." Her gaze returned to him, icy but resigned. Taking Kira's hand, she led her up the ramp. Jonas followed, his boots heavy against the metal flooring. As they stepped into the dim interior of the Endless Horizon, Kira paused and turned to him. "Is this your home?" she asked, her voice small but clear. "No," Jonas replied shortly. "It's a ship." "Do you live here?" "For now." Kira tilted her head, her glowing eyes studying him like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "You're sad," she said softly. Jonas stopped in his tracks. "What?" "You feel sad," she repeated, her tone matter-of-fact. He stared at her, his mind racing. The Giari were said to be empathic, able to sense and influence emotions, but he'd never believed the stories. Now, with this child staring at him as if she could see straight into his soul, he he wasn't so sure. "Stay with your mother," he said gruffly, brushing past her. Jonas guided them to a small cabin at the back of the ship. The walls were scuffed, the cot barely large enough for one person. He motioned for them to enter. "This is it. Stay put." Lyra stepped inside, her posture stiff. "And if we don't?" "Then you make things harder for yourselves," Jonas replied, his tone devoid of emotion. She studied him, her piercing gaze searching for cracks in his stoic exterior. "Is this who you are?" she asked quietly. "A man who sells others to survive?" Jonas flinched inwardly but didn't let it show. "I do what I have to," he said, turning to leave. "You'll regret it," she called after him, her voice low but certain. Jonas didn't respond. He made his way to the cockpit, the weight of her words pressing on him like a lead blanket. As he settled into the pilot's chair, he stared out at the stars. They had always offered him a sense of freedom, a reminder of the infinite possibilities the galaxy held. Tonight they felt cold and distant. He activated the ship's engines, the familiar hum filling the silence. As the endless horizon left the station, Jonas told himself it was just another job. Deliver the cargo, get paid, and move on. But Kira's voice echoed in his mind, her innocent words cutting through his carefully constructed walls. "You feel sad." For the first time in years, Jonas wondered if she was right. The endless horizon moved through the void, its engines a low hum against the infinite silence of space. Jonas Cade leaned back in the pilot's seat, staring at the hyperspace streaks stretching like threads of white fire across the cockpit window. He tried to focus on the navigational console, but his mind wandered back to the cargo. Lyra and Kira. A widow and her daughter. Not a shipment, not a job. People. He cursed under his breath. He needed to stop thinking about them like that. Every time he let emotion creep in, it cost him. Friends lost in battle. Deals gone sideways. Trust betrayed. But Kira's wide eyes and Lyra's biting words had cracked something in him, and he couldn't seem to seal it shut. The ship's internal comm system buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. "Mr. Cade." Lyra's voice was clipped, her GRE accent soft but distinct. Jonas tapped the comm button. "What?" "There's a problem with the cabin." He sighed. "I'll check it out." Jonas entered the small cabin to find Lyra standing by the air vent, her arms crossed and her expression sharp enough to cut. Kira sat on the cot, her doll clasped tightly in her hands. "The air is stale," Lyra said, gesturing toward the vent. "My daughter can barely breathe." Jonas crouched to inspect the vent, his movements curt. "It's not a luxury liner." "That's clear," Lyra said. Her tone carried more steel than complaint. "But even prisoners deserve air." Jonas shot her a look but said nothing. He removed the vent cover, revealing a clogged filtration unit. He muttered a curse and began cleaning it. "Should be better in a minute," he said, not looking up. Kira tilted her head, watching him. "Do you always fix things yourself?" she asked, her voice curious. Jonas paused. "Most of the time." "Why?" "Because no one else will." Kira frowned, as if unsatisfied with his answer. "You don't have any friends?" The question caught Jonas off guard. "Friends just get you into trouble." "That's not true," Kira said, hugging her doll tighter. "Mama says friends help you." "Your mama's wrong." Lyra's sharp intake of breath made him glance up. Her eyes were like molten amethyst, searing into him. "My daughter doesn't need your cynicism," she said. Jonas finished cleaning the vent and stood. She asked. I answered. "You didn't have to answer like that." "I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to do a job." "Then maybe you should remember that," Lyra shot back, her voice low but fierce. Jonas didn't respond. He turned and left the cabin, the weight of their words trailing him like shadows. Back in the cockpit, Jonas reviewed the job details again, trying to drown out his doubts. The data chip provided coordinates, a name, Baronkale Drathos, and payment instructions. He'd heard of Drathos. The man ruled Cult of Five with an iron fist, exploiting alien workers to mine valuable minerals. The Giari's empathic abilities would make them invaluable for such work, sensing and predicting the moods of labor forces to maintain control. Jonas rubbed his temples. Delivering them meant sending a child into a life of servitude. The thought made his stomach churn. He slammed his fist on the console, the clang echoing in the small cockpit. A soft knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Come in," he said, not turning. Kira stepped in, her small feet barely making a sound. She held her doll in one hand and a cup of water in the other. "Mama said you should drink this." Jonas glanced at her, surprised. "I'm fine." "She said you're not." He took the cup reluctantly, his fingers brushing against hers. Her skin was warm, her violet glow soft and comforting. "Thanks," he muttered. Kira didn't leave. She studied him with those wide, knowing eyes. "Why are you sad all the time?" "I'm not sad." "Yes, you are. I can feel it." Jonas stiffened. The GRE's empathic abilities weren't just stories. She could sense his emotions, maybe even understand them better than he did. He set the cup down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Why do you care?" "Because I like you." Her answer was so simple, so pure, that it hit him harder than any insult or accusation. He looked away, unsure how to respond. "Don't let them hurt us," Kira said softly. Jonas's chest tightened. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Go back to your mom." Kira lingered for a moment, then nodded and slipped out of the room. Jonas stared at the empty doorway, her words ringing in his ears. The comm system crackled suddenly. "Unidentified vessel respond," a voice barked. Jonas sat up, his hands flying to the controls. A sleek black ship had appeared on his radar, its silhouette predatory. The comm crackled again. "Drop your engines and prepare for boarding." Jonas cursed under his breath. "Pirates," he muttered. He switched to manual control and veered the endless horizon hard to starboard. The pirate ship followed, its weapons charging. "Brace yourselves," he called over the comm. The first shot grazed the hull, sending a shudder through the ship. Jonas pushed the engines to their limit, weaving through an asteroid field in a desperate attempt to lose his pursuers. In the cabin, Lyra held Kira close, her eyes darting to the shaking walls. "What's happening?" she shouted into the comm. "Trouble," Jonas replied. "Stay put." The pirates gained on them, their ship faster and more maneuverable. Jonas's hands flew over the controls, his mind racing. He spotted a derelict cargo freighter drifting in the field. An idea struck him. "Hold tight," he said. He steered toward the freighter, angling the endless horizon to pass close. At the last second, he fired the ship's grappling cable, latching onto the freighter's hull. The pirates followed, not realizing Jonas had cut the engines and was using the freighter's momentum to slingshot around it. As the pirate ship overshot its target, Jonas reignited the engines and blasted away, leaving them scrambling to turn. He didn't wait to see if they'd recover. He pushed the ship toward hyperspace and initiated the jump. When the stars returned to their normal configuration, Jonas exhaled and slumped back in his seat. His hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline still coursing through him. The comm buzzed. "Are we safe?" Lyra asked. "For now," he said. "You handled that well," she admitted reluctantly. "Thanks," Jonas replied, surprised by the faint note of respect in her voice. But as he stared at the empty void ahead, he knew this wasn't over. The pirates weren't the only ones after him now. The decision gnawed at the edges of his mind. He had broken protocol by escaping. That made him a liability to the Baron. And in his line of work, liabilities didn't last long. The endless horizon cruised through the murky expanse of the fringe territories, its engines running low and quiet. Outside the viewport, the stars seemed distant and cold, their light swallowed by the graveyard of abandoned ships and asteroid debris. This was a place forgotten by most of the galaxy and no man's land where desperation bred opportunists, and even the smallest mistake could be fatal. Jonas Cade sat in the pilot's seat, one hand on the throttle, the other gripping a steaming cup of Synth coffee. His eyes remained fixed on the radar. So far, no pursuit signals had shown up, but that didn't mean they were safe. The Baron's reach extended farther than Jonas liked to admit. Behind him, he could hear soft footsteps, hesitant but persistent. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. "Shouldn't you be with your mother?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Kira's small form appeared in his peripheral vision, her luminous violet skin casting a faint glow in the dim cockpit. She held her tattered cloth doll tightly, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and fear. "She's resting," Kira said. "Can I stay here?" Jonas sighed. "This isn't a playground." "I'm not playing." Her response made him glance at her, one eyebrow raised. Despite the childlike innocence in her voice, there was something resolute about her stance. She climbed onto the co-pilot's chair, her legs too short to reach the floor. For a moment she simply stared out at the void, her glowing skin reflecting faintly off the console. "Why does it feel so lonely here?" she asked, her voice soft. Jonas leaned back, resting his cup on the console. "That's the fringe. It's not meant to feel like anything but emptiness. No one stays here unless they're hiding from something or someone." Kira tilted her head, her gaze fixed on him. "What are you hiding from?" He chuckled, though the sound lacked humor. "Nothing, kid. I just don't like company." She hugged her doll tighter, her glowing eyes unblinking. "That's not true. You're hiding from yourself." Jonas stiffened. "Where'd you hear that?" "I didn't hear it. I feel it," Kira said, her voice matter of fact. "You're always sad and angry at the same time. It's confusing." Jonas turned his attention back to the radar, his jaw tightening. "You shouldn't poke around in people's feelings." "I can't help it," she said. "That's what Mama says." "Maybe your mama should teach you to mind your own business," he muttered. Kyra's small face scrunched into a frown, but she didn't reply. She slid off the chair and padded silently out of the cockpit, leaving Jonas alone with the hum of the ship and the uneasy weight of her words. The endless horizon approached a small outpost nestled on the edge of a massive asteroid belt. It wasn't much to look at, just a cluster of rusted metal structures patched together with salvaged parts. The docking platforms were overcrowded with ships in varying states of disrepair. Jonas knew this kind of place well. Here questions were unwelcome, and credits were king. He docked the ship and powered down the engines. Before stepping off, he turned to Lyra and Kira, who stood near the cabin entrance. "Stay on the ship," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This place isn't safe." Lyra crossed her arms, her violet skin shimmering faintly under the cabin lights. "Nowhere has been safe since you took us." Jonas frowned but didn't rise to her challenge. "Just don't leave the ship," he said, grabbing his blaster and stepping out onto the docking platform. The air outside was thick and stale, the artificial atmosphere heavy with the scent of oil and rust. Jonas scanned the area, his eyes darting to every shadow and crevice. The market stretched ahead, a chaotic sprawl of vendors hawking everything from weapon parts to counterfeit stems. He made his way toward a stall run by a wiry man with sunken eyes and a permanent sneer. "I need fuel and repairs," Jonas said, tossing a data chip onto the counter. The merchant picked up the chip and inspected it before glancing at Jonas. "You're lucky. Prices just went up." Jonas leaned closer, his voice low. "They'll go back down if you know what's good for you." The merchant's sneer widened. "Touchy, aren't we? Fine, I'll give you a deal on one condition." "What condition?" "Condition." The merchant leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Word's been going around. "There's a Ziari widow and her kid on the run. Big bounty on their heads. If you've seen anything or anyone, you let me know." Jonas's fingers twitched toward his blaster, but he kept his expression neutral. "Haven't seen anything like that." The merchant studied him for a moment before shrugging. "Shame. Could have made yourself a fortune." Jonas nodded curtly and walked away, his mind racing. The Baron's reach was wider than he'd feared. He couldn't stay here long, not with whispers of the bounty so close. Back on the ship, Jonas found Lyra pacing the cabin while Kira sat cross-legged on the cot, her doll in her lap. Lyra turned to him, her expression sharp. "What happened?" "We're leaving," Jonas said, brushing past her to the cockpit. "Why? What did you find out?" she pressed, following him. "The bounty's spreading," he said, his voice clipped. "It's not safe here." "It's never safe," Lyra snapped. "When do we stop running?" "When we're out of places to run to," Jonas shot back, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You can't keep making decisions for us," Lyra said, her voice rising. "We're not your prisoners." Jonas rounded on her, his eyes blazing. "You're alive because of me. Don't forget that." The tension between them was thick enough to cut. Kira's small voice broke the silence. "Mama, stop. He's trying to help." Lyra's shoulders sagged, her anger giving way to exhaustion. "Then he needs to tell us what's going on. All of it." Jonas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine. The Baron's got eyes everywhere. This outpost isn't safe, and neither is the next one. I don't know where we're going yet, but staying here isn't an option." Lyra studied him for a moment before nodding reluctantly. "Just don't lie to us. If we're going to survive, we need to trust each other." Jonas didn't respond. He returned to the cockpit, his mind a storm of plans and doubts. As the ship lifted off, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The fringe was vast, but even it wouldn't be able to hide them forever. The endless horizon landed with a sharp hiss of depressurization, its engines sputtering before falling silent. Outside, the desolate moon stretched into jagged cliffs and arid plains. The sky above swirled with gray and green clouds, their ominous churn hinting at volatile weather. The moon was abandoned long ago, a forgotten relic of some failed terraforming project. For Jonas, it was the perfect hiding spot. He powered down the ship and turned to Lyra, who stood at the entrance to the cockpit with Kira peeking around her legs. "We stay low, keep quiet, and don't light fires. This place might be off the maps, but we're not taking any chances." Lyra crossed her arms. "And how long do we plan to stay here? Forever?" Jonas leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "Until I figure out where we're going next." "That's not a plan," she said sharply. "It's survival," Jonas replied. "Take it or leave it." Kira's small voice interrupted them. "Can we go outside?" Both adults turned to her. Jonas's first instinct was to say no, but something about her hopeful expression made him hesitate. "It's not safe," Lyra said firmly, placing a protective hand on Kira's shoulder. Jonas glanced at the barren terrain outside, scanning for threats. The moon's desolation seemed absolute, but he knew better than to trust appearances. "We'll stay close to the ship," he said, surprising himself with his own concession. The air outside was thin and sharp, carrying the acrid tang of unfiltered oxygen. Kira bounded ahead, her bare feet kicking up the fine, gray dust that coated the ground. Her violet skin shimmered faintly in the dim light, and her laughter echoed against the cliffs. For a moment, it was almost possible to forget the danger they were in. Lyra trailed behind her daughter, her movements tense as she scanned the horizon. Jonas stayed closer to the ship, his blaster holstered but within easy reach. He didn't trust the silence. "You don't have to watch her like a hawk," Jonas said, his tone softer than usual. "Let her be a kid for 5 minutes." Lyra shot him a look. Being a child doesn't make her immune to danger. "Neither does wrapping her in bubble wrap," Jonas countered. Lyra opened her mouth to reply but stopped. Her gaze shifted past him, her body stiffening. Jonas followed her line of sight. A faint shimmer flickered against the cliffs, a distortion, like heat waves rippling through the air. "Back to the ship," Jonas said, his voice low and urgent. "What is it?" Lyra asked, already pulling Kira toward her. "Cloaking tech," Jonas muttered. "Someone's here." They barely made it inside the ship before the first shot rang out. The hull reverberated with the impact, the sound a deafening clang that sent Kira diving into her mother's arms. Jonas hit the controls, sealing the hatch and activating the ship's external defenses. "Who is it?" Lyra asked, her voice steady despite the tension in her face. "Could be scavengers, bounty hunters, or worse," Jonas said as he powered up the ship's engines. "Doesn't matter. We're not sticking around to find out." Through the viewport, Jonas caught a glimpse of their attackers, 3 figures in sleek, black armor, their movements fluid and calculated. They carried pulse rifles, the barrels glowing faintly as they unleashed another volley. The ship shuddered under the assault. "They found us fast," Lyra said, gripping Kira tightly. "How?" "Doesn't matter," Jonas said. "Hold on." He slammed the throttle, and the endless horizon lurched into motion, kicking up a cloud of dust as it lifted off. The attackers pursued on foot, their rifles trained on the ship. One of them launched a small, glowing orb that stuck to the hull with a metallic thunk. "EMP," Jonas shouted, veering the ship sharply to the left. The orb detonated, sending a wave of energy rippling across the ship. The lights flickered, and the engine sputtered. "Can you fix it?" Lyra asked, her voice tight with fear. "Working on it," Jonas said through gritted teeth. He rerouted power manually, bypassing the fried circuits. The ship groaned in protest but stabilized, the engines roaring back to life. Jonas pushed them hard, the endless horizon breaking through the moon's atmosphere and into open space. In the relative safety of hyperspace, Jonas slumped back in his chair, sweat dripping from his brow. Lyra stood nearby, her arms still wrapped protectively around Kira, who had buried her face in her mother's shoulder. "What now?" Lyra asked, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and frustration. Jonas didn't answer immediately. He stared at the streaking stars outside the viewport, his mind racing. Whoever was after them wasn't going to stop. The EMP device was military grade, far beyond what most bounty hunters could afford. That left only one option: the Baron's men. "We can't outrun them forever," Jonas said finally. "They'll keep coming." "Then we fight," Lyra said, her tone resolute. Jonas looked at her, surprised by the fierceness in her eyes. "You don't even know what we're up against." "I don't need to," she said. "If we keep running, they'll find us eventually. If we fight, at least we have a chance." Jonas shook his head. "It's suicide." "It's survival," Lyra countered, throwing his earlier words back at him. Kira looked up, her small voice breaking the tension. "We're strong, Mama says. Stronger than they know." Jonas met the child's glowing gaze, her innocence tinged with a wisdom far beyond her years. He exhaled slowly, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. "All right," he said finally. "But if we're going to fight, we do it on our terms. We find somewhere to prepare, somewhere they won't see coming." "And where is that?" Lyra asked. Jonas didn't answer immediately. He stared at the navigation console, his fingers hovering over the controls. An idea began to take shape, dangerous but possibly their best chance. "There's a place," he said, "but getting there won't be easy." "Nothing has been," Lyra replied. Jonas glanced at her, then at Kira. "Then we'd better get moving." The endless horizon emerged from hyperspace, its engines rattling like a wounded animal. Before them stretched a planet cloaked in eternal dusk, its surface a patchwork of barren plains, jagged mountains, and blackened forests. It looked like a corpse of a world gutted and left to rot. The sight sent a chill through Jonas' Cade, though he didn't let it show. He gripped the controls tightly as he guided the ship into the planet's atmosphere. His jaw clenched, and his eyes narrowed, betraying the uneasy felt being here again. Every broken ridge and scorched valley seemed to claw at his memories, dragging him back to the man he'd been when this planet still breathed. "What is this place?" Lyra asked from behind him. Her tone was cautious, probing. Jonas didn't turn. "A mistake," he muttered, his voice taut. Kira, sitting beside her mother, pressed her small hands against the viewport. Her glowing violet eyes scanned the surface, wide with curiosity. "It feels strange, like it's heavy." "It's the weight of death," Jonas said, his voice low. "This world is a graveyard." He brought the ship down near a jagged ridge, where the charred remains of trees formed skeletal silhouettes against the dusky sky. Dust swirled as the endless horizon touched down, settling like ash. Jonas powered down the engines and sat motionless for a moment, staring out at the desolation. "We'll be safe here for now," he said finally, unbuckling his harness. "No one comes to this place. There's nothing left to take." The air outside was thin and acrid, carrying the faint, metallic tang of decay. Kira followed her mother cautiously, her small feet kicking up blackened dust with each step. Jonas led the way, his movements brisk but purposeful. He didn't want to stay here longer than necessary. "What happened to this planet?" Lyra asked, breaking the silence. Jonas stopped, his back to her. For a moment he didn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "War, the kind that doesn't leave survivors." "Were you here?" Lyra pressed, her tone sharper now. Jonas turned to face her, his eyes hard. "I fought here. That's all you need to know." Lyra held his gaze, her expression unyielding. "I think it's not all I need to know. Not if we're trusting you." Jonas exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "This planet used to belong to the Baron's enemies. Rebels, freedom fighters, whatever you want to call them. I fought with them. We thought we could win." He gestured to the barren landscape. "This was the result." Kira tugged on her mother's sleeve, her small voice breaking the tension. "Why did you lose?" Jonas knelt down, his expression softening slightly as he looked at her. "Because we didn't know what we were up against. The Baron doesn't just destroy his enemies. He destroys everything they touch. Their homes, their people, their hope." Kira's glowing eyes shimmered with sadness. She reached out and placed her small hand on Jonas's arm. "It wasn't your fault." Jonas's throat tightened, and he looked away. "Let's just find shelter." They stopped at the base of a crumbling tower, its surface pockmarked with scorch marks and overgrown with jagged, crystalline weeds. Jonas knelt by a rusted hatch partially buried in the ground. With a grunt, he pried it open, revealing a narrow ladder descending into darkness. "What is this place?" Lyra asked, her voice wary. "An old bunker," Jonas said. "We used them during the war. Should still be intact." He climbed down first, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The bunker smelled of rust and mildew, its walls lined with empty shelves and broken crates. A single table stood in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs, their legs warped from the damp. Kira climbed down next, followed by Lyra. The girl wandered toward a corner, her gaze fixed on something Jonas couldn't see. "What is it?" Jonas asked, stepping closer. "There's something here," Kira said, pointing to a pile of rubble. Jonas and Lyra exchanged a look before clearing away the debris. Beneath the rubble was a small, cylindrical object embedded in the wall. Its surface glowed faintly, etched with intricate symbols that pulsed like a heartbeat. "That's GRE," Lyra whispered, her voice tinged with awe. "What's it doing here?" Jonas asked. "This planet was ours once," Lyra said, "before the Baron's War." Kira reached out, her fingers brushing the artifact. The light intensified, bathing the room in a soft glow. Jonas stepped back, his hand instinctively moving to his blaster. "What's happening?" he demanded. Kira closed her eyes, her expression serene. "It's showing me," she said, her voice distant. "Showing you what?" Jonas asked, his voice sharp. Kira opened her eyes, and they glowed brighter than ever. "A place where we'll be safe." Jonas frowned, his skepticism clear. "How can you know that?" "I just do," Kira said simply. Lyra knelt beside her daughter, her expression conflicted. "The artifacts of my people don't lie," she said softly. "They guide us." Jonas rubbed the back of his neck, his mind racing. He didn't trust the artifact, but Kira's certainty was unnerving. "If this is a trap—" "It's not," Lyra interrupted. "If the artifact says there's a safe place, then there is." Jonas exhaled heavily, the weight of their next move pressing down on him. "Then let's hope you're right. Because if you're not, we're out of options." They spent the night in the bunker, its cold walls offering little comfort but adequate protection. Jonas sat alone by the hatch, his blaster resting across his lap. His gaze lingered on the artifact, its soft glow a reminder of how little control he had over this situation. Lyra approached him, her footsteps light. "You don't trust it," she said, more a statement than a question. "I don't trust anything I can't explain," Jonas replied. Lyra sat beside him, her eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes faith is all we have. My people believed in these artifacts for generations. They guided us, warned us, protected us." Jonas shook his head. "Faith didn't save this planet." "No," Lyra admitted, "but it might save us." Jonas looked at her, his expression guarded. "If you're wrong, we all die." "And if I'm right?" she countered. Jonas didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the hatch, the cold steel beneath his hands grounding him in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. The next morning, they prepared to leave. The artifact now sat securely in a crate, its faint glow visible even through the slats. As they boarded the endless horizon, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into the unknown. Kira sat beside him in the cockpit, her small hand resting on the armrest. "It's going to be okay," she said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. Jonas glanced at her, his hardened expression softening. "I hope you're right, kid." As the ship lifted off, the barren planet receded into the distance. Jonas felt the weight of its memories slipping away, replaced by the uncertain promise of what lay ahead. The endless horizon hovered above a swirling nebula of green and gold, its engines humming softly as Jonas Cade studied the holographic display in the cockpit. The coordinates from the ZRE artifact had led them to this uncharted region, far from established trade routes or any signs of life. It felt too quiet, as if the galaxy itself held its breath. Kira sat beside him, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. Her wide, glowing eyes stared out at the nebula. "It feels safe," she said softly. Jonas frowned. "Safe doesn't mean unguarded. Places like this don't stay hidden by accident." Behind them, Lyra stepped into the cockpit, her sharp gaze flicking between the display and the view outside. "The artifact wouldn't guide us into a trap," she said, though her tone carried the weight of uncertainty. Jonas grunted, his skepticism unshaken. "That's a lot of trust to put in an ancient rock." "It's more than a rock," Lyra snapped. "It's part of us. Part of who we were before the Baron destroyed everything." Before Jonas could reply, the radar flashed red. A small fleet of ships appeared at the edge of the nebula, their sleek, black hulls unmistakable. The Baron's hunters had found them. The comm system crackled, and a cold, mechanical voice filled the cockpit. "Giari vessel, power down your engines and surrender. Resistance will not be tolerated." Jonas clenched his jaw. "They've been tracking us since the moon," he muttered. Lyra stepped forward, her voice steady. "We can't outrun them." Jonas's fingers tightened around the controls. "We're not running." He activated the ship's weapon systems, the hum of power reverberating through the hull. The endless horizon was no warship, but it carried enough firepower to make a fight interesting. Jonas set the ship on an evasive course, weaving between the glowing tendrils of the nebula. The first volley of plasma bolts streaked past them, illuminating the cockpit in bursts of blue and orange. Jonas returned fire, the ship's turrets blazing as he aimed for the nearest hunter. The explosion lit up the nebula, briefly scattering the enemy formation. "They'll adapt," Lyra warned, gripping the back of his seat. "Then we'll have to keep surprising them," Jonas said. He banked sharply, dodging another barrage. Kira stood, her small frame steady despite the turbulence. "There's a way out," she said, her voice calm but urgent. Jonas glanced at her. "What are you talking about?" "The artifact showed me. There's a place inside the nebula where they can't follow." "Can't or won't?" Jonas demanded. Kira looked at him, her eyes glowing brighter. "Both." Guided by Kira, Jonas pushed the ship deeper into the nebula. The sensors flickered and failed, overwhelmed by the electromagnetic interference. The glowing tendrils thickened, coiling around the ship like living veins. The hunters hesitated at the nebula's edge, their formation breaking apart as they attempted to navigate the hazardous environment. One ship pressed forward, its determination mirroring the Baron's ruthless will. Jonas fired again, his aim true. The hunter ship erupted in flames, its wreckage swallowed by the swirling mists. "They won't stop," Lyra said, her voice tight with frustration. "They don't have to," Jonas replied grimly. "They just need to outlast us." Kira stepped closer to the console, her hands brushing the artifact's surface where it rested on the dashboard. Its glow pulsed in rhythm with her own, casting soft light across her face. "We're close," she said. Ahead, the nebula parted, revealing a massive structure suspended in the void. Its surface shimmered with the same intricate patterns etched into the artifact, its architecture both organic and technological. It was ancient yet pristine, a remnant of a time before the Baron's conquest. Lyra gasped. "It's a sanctuary." The hunters reached the clearing, their weapons charging. Jonas maneuvered toward the structure, scanning for an entry point. A hatch opened along its side, a bright beam of light extending toward them. "Looks like we're invited," Jonas muttered, steering the ship inside. The interior of the sanctuary was vast, its walls alive with shifting light and pulsating energy. The air felt thick but breathable, carrying a faint hum that resonated in their chests. Jonas powered down the ship and unbuckled his harness, his eyes scanning the strange environment. "What now?" he asked, his voice echoing slightly. Kira stepped forward, the artifact cradled in her hands. "This place will protect us." "How?" Jonas asked, his tone skeptical. Before Kira could answer, the sanctuary seemed to react. Light flowed from the walls, converging around the artifact. Symbols and shapes formed in the air, their meaning incomprehensible to Jonas but clearly understood by Kira. She turned to them, her expression calm and confident. "It's a shield," she said. "Nothing can get in while we're here." Outside, the hunters fired on the sanctuary, their plasma bolts dissipating harmlessly against its shimmering surface. Inside, Jonas watched the display, his body tense despite Kira's assurance. "This won't last forever," he said. "They'll find a way to break through." "No," Lyra said, her voice firm. "They won't. The sanctuary's power comes from us, from the Giari. As long as we're here, it's unbreakable." Jonas stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "So this is it, the end of the line." "It's a beginning," Lyra said. "For all of us." The sanctuary's hum deepened, filling the air with a sense of peace Jonas hadn't felt in years. He looked at Kira, her small frame glowing brighter than ever. She was more than a child. She was hope, a chance to rebuild what the Baron had destroyed. As the hunters retreated, unable to penetrate the sanctuary's defenses, Jonas felt something shift within him. He wasn't just a mercenary anymore. He was part of something bigger, something worth fighting for. "We're not just surviving," he said quietly. "We're fighting back." Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch steady and reassuring. "And this time we'll win." The endless horizon rested in the sanctuary's embrace, its crew no longer running but preparing for the battles ahead. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would build a future.